Welcome to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast. Now, each week we're going to be joined by educational experts from across the globe who will offer exclusive insights, bits of inspiration, and loads of guidance to help practitioners unlock the potential for learning in the early years. Welcome back to TTS Talking Early Years with me, Alistair Bryce-Clegg, and my guests, Julie Pearson and Richard Knight. And in the 4 episodes that we've been recording, we've been talking all about transitions, from those little transitions that children have on a daily basis to the really big ones that affect both children and their families. And in this last episode, we're going to dig a little bit more into how the transitions that we talk about, whether they be transitioning into a new room or maybe up into, as we talked about before, big school, can also be quite difficult for parents to manage. And that difficulty can also affect how children view the transition in general. So, Julie, Richard, in your experience, have you found that parents also can struggle with these transitions?
Yeah, I think so. And I think one thing that's really stuck in my mind from my work, when I used to do lots of work in children's centres, I was working with a family whose baby was due to start at a nursery, and she was really, really upset about that change. And what the parents' biggest worry was that she thought her baby would love her key person more than she loved them. And that's really stuck with me, because I thought, actually, that's a really valid feeling and worry for a parent. So while you're working very much and focusing on, helping that child to settle, if that parent's got that worry that actually I worry that they're going to love you more than they love me, you've got to be able to address and reassure that parent as well. So while that was at the very, probably that baby's first transition, how you supported the baby and that family then was really important, wasn't it? Supporting emotions from both aspects there. So that's always something that I've really been conscious of since, those changes and how families feel. Even that start in school, they'll be growing up, they won't need me so much anymore, they're going to become independent. All of those things that are also going through families' minds and worries are really important to acknowledge, aren't they?
And like we've talked about before, that idea of building a relationship with the carers is as important as building a relationship with the children, because they're less likely to talk to you about that. I mean, that's a really personal thing to say. I'm worried, my child's going to love somebody else more than me. So, you've got to have that element of trust for them to be able to do that. And again, as we know scientifically, we get emotional leakage. So that central nervous system that we've all got is very affected by the emotions of the people around us. And even though parents might be saying, oh, it's big school, it's going to be great, but then they're crying when they drop you off because they're managing their own emotion, all of that then leaks into you. And I remember, hundreds of children will have been dropped off by a upset parent on their first day of nursery or the first day of school. But seeing that upset and not understanding it, or even just feeling somebody trying not to get upset, you carry that through the door with you rather than, and again, it's really hard to do. But I think partly saying to parents, this is not unusual, but these are some of the things that you can do to help that drop off or whatever it is, be better. They're useful strategies, but it's how we manage to communicate those to parents.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it happens both sides, doesn't it? So, I've certainly experienced, I know you have as well, Julie, where you've been receiving children as new starters, and you've had parents absolutely really emotional at the very first time they're away from home, often is coming into the nursery or the setting. And then you also see when they're leaving you and going off to school. And many conversations I've had with families about, we wish they could stay here because we've got such a good relationship with you. They've been coming here for a while. We've got that trust, but all that to do again, in the new place. So again, it's having that conversation. We're really sad to lose Charlie as well, but think about, what future success we've put down for him to go and achieve now. So selling that education journey and sort of doing that really helps with the moving on up to school. But sometimes it's that the transition support you give when you're transitioning in is to the main carer, because the child might be in and might be fine. And I've seen that a lot, where the child's completely fine or fine on the surface, and sometimes they can become upset a little bit later on in that process. But fine to be left for that day or for that starter session, and you've got the parent who wants to hang around in the lobby of the reception, and you're making them cups of tea because they just can't find the strength
absolutely.
to leave them there just yet. So I think that goes back to that point of the whole thing. It is a real process, and sometimes you've got a parent who will be, okay, right, see you later, I'll come and get you when it's time for reception. And you've got that
Bye.
polar opposite of,
Yeah.
this is really difficult for me, and that parent showing that vulnerability of this is tough for whatever reason. And you've got to be really sensitive in your practice for that, for both sides of it.
Yeah, and we talked in earlier episodes about how effective transition was smoothing out the bumps and making the unfamiliar familiar for children, but also it is for parents. So you want that, yes, and you often do get that, I wish they could just stay here because, they love you and they flourish in here. But if we also were able to show that this is what they're going to do, where they go to, this is how it's going to work. These are some, it's almost like, your TripAdvisor review where you've got, and this is, the voices of children around, how happy they are in that space. All of that would help to allay parents. I mean, and then you've got things like parent WhatsApp groups where people have got opinions about, oh, they do this or they do that. And again, what you want to be able to do is to say, well, this is what we do and this is how we do it. But it all keeps coming back to effective relationships with both children, but also, and you've got an easier, in terms of making relationships with children, you see them way more, so you can do that, but also those relationships with parents. But one of the things we talked about at the end of the last episode was the fact that ideally we want to have those strong relationships with parents so we can support them through anything they're going through. We can provide them with information and expertise. We want to have those strong relationships with children so we can support them through what they're going through, help their transition, help their emotional regulation. But we are all basic human beings who are very privileged to do a job that we love. How do we make it so that we don't end up just carrying everybody else's anxiety or trauma? How do we make it so that we can protect our own, mental health and well-being to enable us to be effective in that role?
And that's very tough, isn't it? I think something that, again, Julie and I talk about in our team quite a lot is that, sort of keeping well at work and looking after yourself so you can look after other people. And it's difficult because you absolutely do take on the emotion of others. If someone else is quite upset, it's hard not to feel upset because of that emotional leakage you mentioned. But I think it's, as a team, what support network have you got for each other? So if you're a colleague in a setting, you're another educator, whatever role you're doing, and you can see that key person colleague is having a difficult experience with that family, the transition, or something's changed, or there's a relationship breakdown, and you've got that colleague really supporting that family member in the best way they can, and it's actually, you can see it's taking a toll on them. As a bit of a well-being support for that colleague, what can you do? So what is that support for wellness like in the setting team? So lots of settings now, and we sort of talk about this a lot with inspection readiness and different things. Have you got a wellbeing lead? What's that support for workload issues like, and things like that? Well, it's a similar approach, isn't it? What's that wellbeing support like? Who can you go to? Who's the people that have got your back, and how are you looking after each other so you can best look after yourself, and unpack that a bit with each other? And I think it's, we talk about it a lot, that it's the roundtable discussion. It's just being there and just having that chat. How do you feel about it? You've done a great job supporting Charlie's mum and dad. How are you? I just want to make sure you're okay, actually. And I think it just comes down to that real relational approach as a team where possible.
I think it's also that acknowledgement or that realization that comes to us all, hopefully at some point in our career, that you can't fix everything, because I think because you've got maybe a child who's going through a transition and is feeling it emotionally, maybe a family, and as a human being, you really want to support that. But also there's a overarching professionalism, which means that you've got to be really careful in terms of things like safeguarding and not blurring boundaries too much, that you don't end up, by trying to do a good thing, doing something that ends up being detrimental to either you or the setting or the space. So I think you're dead right, Richard, in terms of not waiting for these things to happen, but having, and not just policies that, sit in your computer, that commitment to a system where we know that we all live lives as human beings that will have pressure in them. We are dealing directly with a large number of families who are all having those pressures, and they will come to us, usually through the medium of their children and how they're responding to that. So it is going to happen to every single practitioner. You can't just say, well, I'm not interested in that. So what do you have in your space that really actively is a culture of how do we support each other in the unspoken role that we do as early years educator, which is the counsellor, social worker, advisor, which you can't not do because it's basically linked to human existence.
Yeah, and I think some of that comes down to a really high quality supervision as well, doesn't it? And making sure that there's that time to talk about well-being in that, that the time's put aside so people can genuinely talk about how they're feeling, and that manager has those resources where they can support educators, but also know where to signpost. And actually, I think you might, you may need benefit from some further support from here or from there. And I think that's really key, because yes, supervision is important for many, many reasons, and we know it's important in safeguarding, but sometimes we can end up rushing that bit where it's how are you and is there anything I can do to support you. So how do we keep that time safe for that as well, and spend that time on picking well-being as part of that?
Because we know ultimately, and I think we've talked about this a little bit, we are in a much better place as a society now than we were even 10, 15, 20 years ago. But if we don't have really good mental health, well-being and resilience, then it doesn't matter what else we're doing. If we don't feel in a place to really manage everything that's going on in our world and in our professional and personal world, then we're not going to be in a position to do it. So, I mean, we started in episode 1 talking about the kind of transitions, everything from nappy time to snack time to leaving the carpet. And what we've done through these episodes is really show how transition in its broadest sense for children is never just about children. It's also about the adults and the environment they come from, but also the environment that we put them in. And there will be transitions within the workplace, personal and professional transitions. So like we talked about before, it could be people who are moving rooms, or a member of staff leaves to another job and somebody else comes and takes their place. So even within our settings, we need to look at transition in the broadest sense, which is how our setting transitions and how that affects the adults that are in it, that will affect the children that are in it. And I think that is, as we've said, is just about really positive communications, but also how we communicate that to parents. If we were thinking about strategies then for really supporting parents to support their children in their transitions, but also that took into account how important their own transitions are in that process, how can we kind of relay that information to parents in a way that doesn't feel judgmental, or the fact that we're telling them how they should be living their life, or any strategies around that?
I think sometimes it's about that, it's that drip feed approach, isn't it? It's not giving families lots of information at the same time. So you're building those relationships, and you're able to start sharing some of these messages. Maybe if a child's become upset coming into the nursery, it's a perfect opportunity, isn't it, to model emotions and that language of emotions, and maybe that opens up a conversation later on in the day to say, oh, maybe you could try this at home, or what about sharing this story? So it's about always thinking of those learning opportunities yourself as an educator. That when can I sort of share these messages with families? How can I support that home learning environment around that, and help families again understand what transitions are? Because again, families can get very focused on the fact that transition is school. How do we make sure everybody's on the same page, that transitions are everywhere, they're happening all the time, and they're certainly not one-off events? So to me, it's everybody being on the same page and be able to complete drip feed and continue those messages, rather than it being, we're going to share this message with families, that bit's done, on to the next thing. It's that ongoing support.
Richard, do you have any practical examples of how you've actually done that in your settings or in your career so far?
Yeah, I think for me, and something myself and Julie spoke about a lot, and something we are collectively talking about quite a lot now, is that getting the communication right. So to pick up on your point, Alistair, about how to communicate that without coming across as condescending or judgy, or that actually will, very educationally sometimes. And it's being real. I think it's having that real discussion. If a family is coming to you, and this has happened to me a few times, and they're talking about their child's behaviour, and we know that we're seeing some interesting or different behaviours, for example, because of changes that are going on, time of transition, parent may have left, and the parent's dealing with that. They're also saying, well, child is behaving differently. Freya's not eating, Freya's not sleeping, all these things. I think it's I've always tried to open up dialogue around emotional intelligence in terms of just imagine how they're feeling. How are you feeling? Think about how you feel for a minute.
Yeah.
Why do you think they're going to feel any different? You feel the way you do, and it's a struggle, and you understand things. These little ones are feeling all of that and can make no sense of it because they're learning to navigate the world in which they live, and everything they know has changed and different. So it's unsettling. So we're going to see behaviours that are challenging, behaviours that are difficult sometimes. It could be language, it could be hitting, physical, and that comes from confusion. We know that behaviour is that tip of the iceberg of all the feeling underneath usually. So I think it's been real enough to have the discussion and say, well, let's get real here and think about how they might feel, because we know how we feel, how you feel, and use that as a starting point as well. And I think that's what the best key persons are good at, in terms of just having that very good discussion about teaching parents, educating parents, families sometimes about sometimes bringing out that empathy bit in terms of, we've got to validate how this child feels, because, you are looking for validation about how you feel as well. And you're going to get that from your peers, your friends and your family. We've got to do this for Charlie and Freya or Imran, because they're feeling just the same, but can't understand any of it. So painting a bit of a picture is what I've tried to do through my career and talk to my teams about, in terms of, let's just try and understand how that child might feel. And then automatically, once you do let yourself in that space, you change how you approach and support, because you're like, oh yeah, actually, it's not just about me, it's about us and them and that togetherness. So I think it's just very relational, but communication is key, which we know is a theme we've been talking about, but a real honest discussion about emotional intelligence. And if you feel like this, so do they. So what does that mean now?
And I think some of it is around skills of coaching. And I remember, as a very new teacher for me, which is where I started in early years. So I'd have been in my very early 20s, had no kids, wasn't married, and then you've got people who have got issues that you can't even begin to understand because you lived them, and then you're trying to give advice. So you learn through error, really, and success and mistake. But there is a real argument for part, and again, we're just adding to the list of things that we could do as settings, but coaching with staff around how can you approach parents generally, how can you approach them around difficult situations? Because again, when you've got something that you need to say to a parent that's difficult about something their child has done, like biting or hitting or kicking, it's really hard not to do that thing where you're saying, oh, can I just have a word in front of everybody else? And it's a bit like, the walk of shame. And then how do you start that conversation where you're saying, oh, well, unfortunately, today Charlie did this. And again, as a parent, as soon as you hear those words, well, unfortunately, immediately your heckles go up. And you're like, well, what were you doing? Why weren't you supervising? So you don't want to start a conversation from a position of that. So those things you learn over time, it would be really good if, as staff teams, there was an opportunity to say, look, when you've got to deliver a difficult message to a parent, what are some good ways that you can do that in terms of approach? Because again, if we're talking about transitions, emotional transitions for parents, so you're standing waiting to pick up your child, you think life is good, you think about what you're going to eat for tea, and then suddenly you've got somebody saying, can I just have a word? Again, emotionally, you're not going to be like, oh yeah, that's fine. You're thinking, oh, what's going on now? What's happening here? Am I going to be the talk of the WhatsApp group tonight? All those things going on in your head. So we need to support parents in their emotional transitions to support their children. And what you also don't want is that thing where the parent then says, oh, Charlie, I can't believe you've bitten. Why have you done that? Da, da, da. Because that kind of shame-based parenting, which we don't mean to be bad, just due to what comes out, that doesn't make it any more effective in terms of how then we resolve that issue with Charlie and the Biting.
It doesn't, and I think providing if as leaders we can provide some CPD for our teams or for each other around challenging conversations, and you know, it's something that we're developing all the time as well in terms of how best to have challenging discussions, and giving that emotion coaching through that in that delivery of that CPD is giving that strategy and that base. But don't get me wrong, it's easy to sit and say it when you're in that moment having a difficult discussion. It's tough, and I probably remember the toughest discussion I've ever had at work was as a trainee practitioner many years ago, where one boy had got the scissors and cut off these beautiful pigtails in the room, and we were absolutely mortified and trying to think of who to blame in the team who wasn't watching this, and we were trying to do a blame game with each other. We're thinking, oh my goodness, you know, Ava's mum's going to be picking her up in half now. What we're going to say? Who's saying, you're the manager, you say, I'm just a trainee, all this stuff. And it was horrendous because we were so worried about that. So all of the CPD can help and give you a strategy. But there are going to be those very, very tough discussions in whatever frame and context to come in, where you've just got to have it. And I think it's, you know, having confidence in your work is going to help with that. But certainly some CPD and coaching around, you know, challenging, difficult discussions, because that's all about working with families. You're going to have tricky discussions all the time.
Yeah, it is. And it's about when that parent is irate. I had a similar thing when I was a head teacher of a child who had very long hair, and another one just cut a huge lump. And her mum was irate. We had letters to governing body. We had banned scissors from the classroom, threatened to take you to court. And again, understandably, a child's just had their hair hacked off by somebody else with a pair of scissors. But it's, again, not leaving anybody as a lone soldier out there kind of fighting the cause, knowing that you've got a bank of support around you that will support you in that. But some, especially in my early career, coaching around how you approach difficult, or if a parent becomes anxious or angry as a result of where their emotions are at, you know, understanding that and being able to take a back step or diffuse rather than do the whole thing where you're like, well, I'm not speaking to you any longer, it's not my fault. So as we are getting to the end of this episode, I'm going to kind of put you both on the spot ever so slightly and just say, I mean, we've talked about loads, but if you could pick one of the things that we've talked about that's to do with transitions that you think is really meaningful, just as a final takeaway, what would it be, or what aspect of transitions do you think that would be really good for people who are listening to this to focus on?
I think for me that the conversations we had around play and checking we're all on the same page around you know what we can do to value that and really acknowledge those smaller transitions, because at the end of the day that's what's going to lay the blueprint for how children do manage the big changes such as a bereavement or starting school. So for me, I think that reflection on those smaller transitions is really valuable. Yeah.
Richard?
And I absolutely agree. I was going to say something similar, but I think not forgetting those small changes, the often forgotten small changes, are a big deal for children. So just really putting in some time and investment into how we approach children to navigate those everyday small changes, and reminding the family that those small changes will happen at home as well. How many times will a family come into you and say, actually, they don't want to come in, they don't want to come in for the tea or something like that. But again, what we learn about supporting and managing, for want of a better word, those small changes, have that chat with the family as well, so we're getting that consistency, but don't forget those small changes.
And I think for me, it's the fact that transition can often be talked about just in terms of the child. And actually, what we've discussed in these episodes is transition is about the child, the family, the practitioner, the setting, and all of those things come together to make that one big thing. So you can't tackle any in isolation. It needs to be tackled all together. Do you know what, Richard and Julie, it's been just fascinating to chat to you over these 4 episodes about transition. We literally probably could have chatted all day, which is often the case, but you've come up with some really interesting, fascinating and practical things that we can do just to make transitions better for children, which in turn makes transitions better to us. So Richard Knight and Julie Pearson, thank you so much for joining me on this TTS Talking Early Years podcast. It's been brilliant.
Thank you.
I'd like to say a huge thanks to our guests today, Julie and Richard, for joining us and providing such valuable insights into everything about transition. You've been listening to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Alistair Bryce-Clegg, and my guests, Richard Knight and Julie Pearson. Now, if you've been inspired by our conversation today, then don't forget you can sign up via the link in our episode notes, and then you'll be the first to hear about future episodes and also have access to exclusive follow-up content. And that includes ideas for your settings and lots of links to really relevant resources.